Ah, there you go.
Great. Amazing. Was it just that link?
Yeah, kind of.
Some steps, okay. Maybe we should at some point set up a STP account or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can just give you the circle's regular YouTube username and password anyway.
Okay, let's see if I can share.
Oh, yeah.
Oh shit! I need to move this to this desktop. Then I need to move this also to this desktop. And then I can. Ah, perfect.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Works.
Okay. What about now?
Yeah, it works great.
Okay.
I just wait for Caron to arrive. I think he gave up on my capacity to solve this problem and went to have a smoke or something. By the way, man, did you have any chance to? I know you were working and traveling this weekend, but did you have any chance to take a look at that crazy chapter I sent you?
I only read the page, but it was really good.
Yeah, it's. I think it's the most polemic thing I've managed to write this far.
Let me pull it up again. Yeah, it's really crazy, man. This. Is it so? It's the political economy of clinical practice, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Uh, I think it turned out nicely, but it's a very weird approach to stuff. So I'm not sure if it works. But
Yeah, I think it starts with a really nice point. This thing about the entire all the criticisms against psychoanalysis regarding um, the power relations. It misses the fact that psychoanalysis tries to dissolve those relations, right? But it's like you are you have to go through some process there before you can dissolve it.
yeah, but I mean, I mentioned that just to kind of poke fun at analysts because my impression is that even though a lot of ink is spilled over debates on how Foucault got it wrong, how Husserl got it wrong, and everyone is talking about interpellation and power got it wrong concerning psychoanalysis, even though that's true, that's almost a truism now. So why not move on to things where others didn't get wrong, like where there are actual problems, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that analysts are slightly relieved that people are discussing power rather than capital or money because we know that that they're how do you call it, like banging at an open door, like knocking on an open door, when the matters power relations and things like this, because analysts are as much invested in dissolving power relations as these other authors.
Mm-hmm.
Where things get a bit more complicated is when you look at the economics of psychoanalysis and you get to the basic fact that it is a commercial service like any other. So is that totally irrelevant?
Yeah.
In one sense, analysts they do think power relations are relevant to analysis. They just think that they're on the right side of the matter. Whereas on the question of economics and monetary exchanges, analysts rather say that this doesn't matter. Not that because saying that they are on the right side of it is not like they're really doing anything to dissolve it or subvert like monetary exchange. They just rely on it like a baker does.
Right.
So that's, that beginning is not so much to kind of further emphasize that psychoanalysis is on the right track, and more about saying that this is kind of a false problem that we like to entertain for other reasons. So this is, let's say, the furthest I went into very weird kind of outside view of psychoanalysis. Like I try to explain what a demand is in an analytic process, not from the standpoint of what Freud studied, in Lacan studied and called demand, but what microeconomics called demands, in terms of relation between demand and supply and things like this.
Yeah.
So it turns out to a very weird discussion, but
that is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a weird kind of approach, but I really think that I've needed the book so nicely, like chapter to chapter now. At least they're enough connected that some stuff there doesn't really make sense if you read it out of context. Even though I do think that, from people I know, you're probably the one who best knows the context of all the stuff I've been working on. So it should make some sense, but it's kind of, it relies a lot on what I've built on other chapters to get to it. Where is the guy? Where is Caron?
Yeah, let's see.
While we're waiting, man, did you get a chance to mull over the whole question about graduate studies and things like this?
Yeah, I'm still mulling over it. Yeah, no, definitely I'm going to go in that direction. I need to look at what programs, but I think I'm convinced from our last talk that I'm not going to pursue some kind of like pure math program, but something where I can already send in this kind of research that I'm doing today as proof that I'm doing something. Right? Like it just doesn't have the same value if I sent something about markets and value and topology. If I sent that into a math department, it probably wouldn't hold as much water.
Yeah, that's my impression, man. Like I think that you'll be better. You are better fit for a place where you're going to be seen as a philosopher, somebody interested in sociological, economical questions with extra interest in mathematics that might lead you to take classes in pure mathematical departments and things like this, than somebody who is, on the other side, like interested, fitting into the maths department, but with, let's say, a kind of a flirt with philosophy and these other matters. Like it's not they won't necessarily take this as an additional a bonus,
Yeah.
So,
yeah, personally, it's a lot more interesting to me too. I don't know what I was thinking. I would like want to just solve math problems all day, but it's not exactly.
It sounds amazing, but at the same time, it's I don't know. I have the impression that you should worry your strategy more about getting in than about what you're going to do when you're there. Like nothing prevents you once you're inside one of these programs to kind of dedicate asymmetrical amount of time to working together with people and from other departments and seeing what they're doing and attending classes and things like this, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. One thing is, yeah, working on this presentation is really good because can actually consolidate some ideas. But we're not doing the thing where we write a text anymore, right?
Yeah, I think that we agreed to write like a small research update, right?
Mhm.
Like I presented on this and that. I'm gonna take the research this or that direction or something like this. What happened to Caron, man? Like he was just here.
I was having this issue earlier where none of my messages were showing up on Facebook.
Oh, really?
Yeah, until like 10 minutes later, then suddenly I saw you guys were having a conversation. Um,
It's weird. Man, by the way, I might be going to the States. Uh, Daniel Tutt got me in touch with people from the Washington Lacanian School, and they might pay for my tickets to go to States next year.
amazing. Is this the? I got an email. I wonder if it's the same thing.
Not from the LAC conference thing, no.
Oh, it's not the LAC
No,
conference.
no, they would actually get me to do a workshop and like a private thing in the Lacanian forum. But
Uh,
if I'm, you know, we should try to to arrange something just so we can see each other. I mean, you know, you guys have. We need to. I need to kind of. I will try to coordinate so I can be around when you guys are getting married and things like this, so we can, you know, plan everything together.
yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, we've been holding off too long on the marriage thing.
Ah, great, he's here.
Great. So we can start, right?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, okay.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, this will be pretty informal as I'm still working on these ideas. So please, if you have any questions, just chime in as I'm presenting, and then we can have a conversation on it. I'm sure it will help me a lot to clarify things. So this presentation is on these four topics: value, price, time, crisis, and I'm trying to, uh, connect these ideas together in some kind of way that's consistent with how the circle operates. Um, so I think it's very invaluable to see it from the lens of very practical questions of organizing today and um, right, because these things are all in some ways these themes are always present in um, like for just simple things like creating a project document for the circle. Um, how do we maintain economic relations in the circle, or will the circle ever uh, make profit or need to interact with the market? Um, and then, like obviously, with time and crisis, you have the question of the political climate and economic problems uh, within our respective countries. So all these themes are very much, I mean, they're very general themes. Um, So the way I want to approach it is, are you guys seeing the slide transition here?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes, I'm seeing. Okay.
Yeah, for the agenda, yes, I want to talk about basically my previous work, which I published in Crisis and Critique. I had two papers kind of dealing with the same idea, which is like value and appearance. So trying to analyze value using Badiou's philosophy, and so I'll kind of describe that from how I stand now, what I see that work as amounting to, and then go into kind of different directions that we can go from there. But a lot of this will be familiar from that text, right? It's some of the same ground. So yes, in the previous text, the main kernel there was that the market can be seen as a machine for sheafifying prices, which is a really kind of a far-fetched thing. It's like it's using an idea from mathematics, but it's not really a mathematical statement. It's almost like it's like a science fiction premise in a way, because it's really treating markets as being this kind of almost like self-organizing force, kind of artificial intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, and trying to understand that from using this idea of the sheaf, which in mathematics is a very powerful, very general way of gluing together objects. So we'll talk more about that. But yeah, so the idea is how does the market determine prices of things, right? That's the basic question. And how can we understand that from kind of first principles, from the very beginning, in terms of exchange between individuals, and then that minimal unit of exchange leads to the question of value, the exchange value versus use value. Pretty much, you could think of it in a way as just trying to follow Marx's own analysis, but using modern mathematical principles. So yeah, basically I want to make this statement clear, and I've outlined 4 sub-ideas that I need to, I think if I elaborate these 4 sub-ideas, this sheafifying prices thing will become a lot clearer. So the first idea is that value is an appearance, which both depends on and determines prices. So what does that mean? I think, well, the next slide I'll talk more about it, but I want to basically clarify what is phenomenology in Badiou's sense. So I'm taking explicitly the approach that appearances can exist without a subject. So we can have such a thing as an objective appearance, when value is one such type of appearance. It is it's objective because obviously we can't really we can tell ourselves that money is not money is just an idea. Money is not it's a social relation, and we don't need to respect it. Money is not everything, etc. But yet we act in a way that keeps the abstraction alive. And this is something Zizek talks about a lot as well. This idea that the abstraction lies at the level of the activity, not at the level of the mind. So yeah, that's basically the idea there. But I'll go further into that. And then the second statement is that there's a topology of markets, and that this topology is not geographical, but of a political economic nature. So that's what probably the majority of this sequence of slides will illustrate, or this presentation. I want to clarify, okay, what does that mean to have a topology of markets? What are the relations between markets as entities, right? Because normally we build our economic thinking, or economic thinking usually begins with microeconomic assumptions about the individual. This idea that when I make an exchange with somebody, I'm entering into this situation where both parties will walk away with something, right? In the case of the seller, he's walking away with more money. In the case of the buyer, some kind of value from the transaction in terms of the whatever product you're buying, right? This marginal utility theory that I'm getting a little more for selling than I would have for keeping some commodity, and then somebody is getting more from buying than versus keeping their money. Right, to summarize that. So okay, that's the general microeconomic picture. But if we start from the idea that markets are the central agent, central subject, or whatever of the process, then we can ask different questions, right? Instead of asking, okay, how are individuals behaving, and how does that behavior signal or become the prices of commodities? We can talk about how does the topology of markets, how does the relative standing of markets in relation to each other, how does that influence prices? And a very simple example of this is, simply buying something in one market and taking it into another market and selling it, right? So we're talking about the kind of the intersection between markets. Simple historical example would be, when Europe first discovered the New World, the Americas. This was the interaction of two markets for the first time, and there was not a clear way of pricing things, right? So gold, for example, was obviously something really valuable in Europe, and the first exchanges that happened in the Americas were for gold. But the Europeans gave like trinkets or things that were not very valuable in their market. So this first interaction between two different markets, it kind of illustrates that there is this this moment before prices have become set, before there is a market that encompasses both of those markets. That's where we're saying that something political can be introduced, right? Clearly, pricing gold, for example, the true value of gold cannot be answered when it's a question of a group of people coming to a land that is rich in gold, but insofar as the people there do not know its value in the other market. Okay, so that's kind of a vague idea, but yes, there is this interaction between markets that produces the fluctuation of prices. And then point 3 is the convergence of prices, which is a process we can formalize with the concept of a sheaf. So again, we have the interaction between markets, which is kind of this undecidable moment. And then something happens to normalize the situation, right? And this something that happens is that a new market is created, right? When Europeans colonized the New World, they produced a new market which consisted of both the resources of the New World and the existing market in Europe. And this process of let's say, gluing or sticking together two different markets, that's something that we can formalize with a sheaf. A sheaf is exactly the mathematical expression of putting two mathematical objects together and making a new object that's consistent with the two that you put together, right? Roughly speaking. So I need to clarify that point as well. What is it? What is a sheaf from a technical standpoint? And then how can we kind of borrow that idea from mathematics to talk about markets converging? And then the fourth point is more direct. It's simply that this process can fail. It often fails. And the reason it fails is it cannot be really grasped from the economic perspective entirely. Like, things that influence the price of something are not necessarily formalized inside the market itself, right? I mean, that's the whole point of a market in a way, is the market captures information from the outside as prices. So when I'm saying here that when this process fails, you have what I call a degeneracy in the underlying topology. So the topology is somehow twisted or deformed in such a way that the process of gluing markets together fails, right? So in the case of the Americas and Europe, you have wars, for example, wars for independence. Something happens maybe in a political sense, and the two markets that were joined together suddenly cannot be joined together smoothly anymore, right? There's some disturbance in that process, right? And then my thesis that I tried to put forward at the end of that text is simply that, like, what if the global topology of all markets considered in totality, what if that topology always has a degeneracy? In the sense, like, there can never be one single market that smoothly integrates all the smaller markets beneath it, right? And what happens, and I try to use like an example from mathematics of how that's possible, how there are certain topological objects in math where locally it looks very good, right? In the mathematical sense, it looks very smooth or unperturbed in some way. That you can do calculus, for example, in this local section of some space. But then if you were to enlarge your view to encompass the entirety of that space, you find certain properties that cannot be found in any local section. Instead, it only appears in the global view. So in this case, what happens if the global dimension of the market, the global not dimension, but the perspective of the market is such that there can never be this convergence, this absolute convergence. And any attempt to force that convergence, can lead to even an even worse situation sometimes. Okay, so yeah, these are the 4 points that I want to try to elaborate here. Okay, so in elaborating the first point, what is value as appearance? Okay, I'll just read this. So yeah, the first is that the gap between use value and exchange value is phenomenological, but it does not require a subject to operate. So here I'm kind of directly borrowing from Badiou's system, right? His logics of worlds is exactly this. It's a phenomenology which doesn't require subjectivity, right? So it articulates appearances which are objectively there. They are consistent in themselves, and the subject is just, let's say, something that can, on a very contingent basis, it can explore or perceive this space, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it, right? So these are the different worlds that the subject can traverse, right? You can go between worlds, but these worlds, even if you leave them, they are consistent in themselves. So I think one way to read this formula of value as appearance is simply to say that value, it consists of many worlds. There's value can have many different faces, right? It doesn't. There's no. Does not necessarily have to be one global conception of value, even though money is kind of a tool that we use to try to bridge different conceptions of value. Again, if we talk about the Europeans coming to the New World, exchanging gold for or exchanging something that they, I don't know, some useless items that they brought with them in their ships for gold, right? There is something there where you're trying to bridge two different worlds through exchange. But it's phenomenological because it's purely it's purely based on some kind of consistency which is not given beforehand. It's contingent, let's say, some consistency which is contingent on the history of Europe, the fact that gold is really popular there, and the fact that it's kind of so plentiful in the New World that it wasn't it wasn't really taken that seriously, right? At least that's the kind of the narrative of that, right? The Indians did not care whether they got, I don't know, toilets or whatever from Europe, as long as it was something new and different, they could exchange their gold.
Two questions. One practical here. Neither Caron nor I are seeing. Are you changing the slides? Because for us, it's still on the agenda one.
Oh, really? Okay. But now.
I changed. Shit, you went through all those?
No. I went ahead.
Oh, okay. Because we were watching the agenda thing all the way till now.
Yeah, I was copying like crazy here what you're saying because we hadn't had a slide, so I was here.
Very hard to follow.
I was here copying like crazy. Okay.
I think I need to have it up on my screen for it to update. I actually have two windows open.
That's probably.
Yeah.
But while you're doing that, let me just ask you a question, because just to clarify, because if I follow you from reading your text, you're saying first that this first statement that you have on the screen, right? Value is an appearance. By appearance, you mean the very specific concept that Alain Badiou uses in his Logics of Worlds as a particular, let's say almost like existence, right? Almost like synonymous with existing within a certain transcendental regime that he calls a world, right?
Yeah.
And then the novelty of his proposal is that he defines the transcendental in such a way that he doesn't need the transcendental subject, to define a transcendental. He can define it as an invariance that is totally immanent to the relations between these existences. It doesn't really depend on the subject for us to understand in which sense it is both organizing that appearance and transcending it in some sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So within that, you get to a bit of a what seems to me like a contradiction, because on the one hand, you're giving a lot of examples. Like, it's true that markets relate, and that, let's say, as Marx said it, I mean, historically, the first sort of commodity exchange we know of is mercantilist exchange, right? Merchant capital, where you buy cheap and sell expensive, sell for high price, buy low and sell high, right? That presupposes that you're in two systems of value.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it seems like, and I mean, Marx, he keeps that. He says, you know, the thing about merchant capital, that you need two value systems for commodities to be exchanged. That remains the basic principle of industrial productive capital. So he just says that these two systems of value, they are the two markets that are at stake at the productive system, which is the labor market, in which you buy labor, and the internal market to whom you sell the commodities. Let's say, so that mismatch of two systems is no longer geographical, as in the case of merchant capital, nor temporal, as when you, for example, lend money, then charge with interest the return, which is a temporal mismatch.
Mm-hmm.
Valued at T1, then valued differently at T2, rather than at two spaces. And he says productive capital, he values in two ways at the same time in the same place, because you use labor in accordance to one system and you pay labor in accordance to another system.
Yeah, exactly.
Because labor is valued in accordance to how expensive it is at that right moment to buy labor, which is itself based on the commodities in the market that the laborer needs to survive. So right now, to buy food and shelter, I need X amount of money. So that's how wage of that laborer is basically determined. But once I buy the labor, I can use the guy's time any way I want to produce commodities. So the commodities produced will enter a market that will be changed by their entry in a way that's different from the market which determine the value of labor. So there are two systems interacting, kind of not touching one another at the point of labor force. Labor force is priced in one way, but it is used in another way. So those are the two systems, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of more than one system and the interaction between systems is at the heart of commodity exchange, even when it is based on one single internal market, where, like Henry Ford style, we build cars and then we buy the cars we build. Even in that case, there are two value systems.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah,
sure. But that means that from the beginning, let's say loosely defined, we're also always speaking about two systems of value, never of as one. Whereas Badiou's logics of worlds defines value or defines appearance in terms of its existence within one transcendental regime. So in your presentation thus far, you already had to kind of, because you're not defining terms so strictly yet, you had to move between two concepts. One where markets are worlds, markets are transcendentals of prices, and therefore the interaction between two markets is the interaction between two transcendentals, and the view where both of these regions that we call markets are in fact part of the same world, which you then call value or something like that, which is why value is an appearance.
Well, I would say that.
But I mean, just to conclude, why am I saying this? Because I think that there are ways to make a bit more precise what you want to say in either one of the two terms that I think you're flirting with. If you want to say that, let's say, value concerns one transcendental, and that there's a sort of envelope that expands the reaches of the world insofar as you can turn new markets or new. It would be perhaps from a Marxist point of view not really correct to call them markets, because let's say gold for a Native American who didn't really see any use for it is not exactly a good being sold at a market, because that's not really defined by the fact that it has utility for others. It can be inscribed, for example, in the system of gift giving, which ascribes value to it in a non-economic sense, at least not in the capitalist or commodity sense. So I agree that we're talking about the interaction of systems, but the word value here might take a polysemic function, because you're talking about, let's say, Indians in Brazil and Portuguese people who arrived here inscribed objects into different systems of value in a very broad sense of determining the use and function of those objects within certain normative regimes that are totally incompatible. Like, I'm not giving you gold or anything that I have because I want something in exchange based on some proportion, but I might be giving it to you as a gift so I can have power over you, because that's how gift giving works. So while for one party this is a commodity exchange in some very strange sense, because I'm getting something that I value a lot in terms of commodity, but for having to expend almost nothing. Whereas for the other, it seems like it's a gift-giving activity, establishing a pact that probably the Portuguese will later not honor and will be surprised or something. So we should have a word for this, for how things are included into a sort of communal sense, communal normative sense or use that is not exactly the same as value. And then I would even go as far as saying that it seems to me that the correct word is use. That's the usage of it. Like, gold has a use within a certain normative regime for Native Americans that is different from the use it has in commodity exchange. Then value, more strictly defined, will be something that operates with that normative difference between regimes. And I think this actually helps to clarify something that you really nicely wrote there in one of the first slide on the agenda, with the difference between cognitive and acognitive mapping. Because historians who study the formation of what they call world economy, which is proper capitalist economy, which is not necessarily something that is global, but has the potency to be global, right? Is precisely that it's a world system that doesn't rely on the homogenization of normative systems, of subsystems now, to function. On the contrary, it thrives on that difference, right? So it's.
I was going to ask about that, because I don't really understand what's meant by acognitive mapping. So and I having difficulty binding this to what you are saying, if this has something to do with the world economy that doesn't need to unify what you are calling worlds. So I'm a bit lost there. Perhaps it's a case of a lack of the proper reading. I don't know, but I was hoping you could both clarify that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to approach it very simply, but yeah, I agree that it does risk a lot of misunderstanding, especially if we consider how value is used by Marx. Then yeah, this distinction between use value and exchange value, or more to Gabriel's point, the use of labor versus the exchange of the products of labor, right? That is different from merchant capital, where you buy something in one area and you sell it somewhere else, right? Yeah, basically the gap between use and exchange is not the same as the gap between exchange and two different markets.
No, yeah, but I mean, Mark's point is that it has a similarity. What I was trying to get to, just to, I think, answer a bit of what Caron was saying, in that I think it's what for me is the nice underlying point that the way you phrased it brings to view is that for these guys who define world economies in this sense, look, capitalism was able to expand the way that it did because it's one particular system of organizing necessities and exchange of goods and so on that preserves differences between normative systems. It exploits these differences. It doesn't seek to unify and homogenize them. For example, if you have an empire that is expanding, it will tax every place that it gets. So it homogeneously extracts wealth from everywhere. It doesn't seek to profit from the difference of places. It seeks to profit from the sameness of places.
Yeah.
So it wants to tax and simply have a number describing how much it can get from every place. How they produce, what they produce doesn't matter, right? Capitalism is able to accommodate so much inequality and tension and crisis and so on because the difference between value systems in this broad sense of value, right, is beneficial for it. So to have a place that is in crisis, a labor crisis, and another place where you have a lot of automation, and a place where labor is cheap, like that's why you always get a sort of displacement of divisions of labor, displacement between who buys and who sells and who makes what. So one of the ways of studying what a world economy is, right? And then the word is not, that's what I wanted to get at. Like there's a reason why they call this a world economy. It's not simply because it's global. It's because it does manage to unify something at the same time that it doesn't glue together in a simple sense these normative subsystems. So why is the difference? And I think that the acognitive idea is interesting because what I think that, I mean, there's a long discussion there I would like to have at some point concerning a sort of underlying methodology of this approach. Because classically, Marxism went to philosophy, to dialectics, to find a model of thinking and a logic for approaching economic categories that is able to give economic movement some autonomy and say, look, just because like these things go on without us, and by going on, like dialectics is a way of approaching development of concepts and very practical articulation of abstractions that gives them movement. So they can kind of go against our own better knowledge or our grasping of them and still be rational, even in this negativity. Whereas you're taking an approach where this is, let's say, substituted for, not for dialectics, but for a mathematical area that has some very common properties with dialectics, which is category theory. Because, and I think, I mean, that's my take on it, category theory is the first part of mathematics that's able to integrate the modeled and the model in an immanent relation. But that's another problem. So why is this useful? Because there is this guy, Badiou, who defined through category theory a way of talking about a world where you don't need to presuppose that a certain system, a basic normative principle of organization is shared by everything in that world. So in the economic case, this is very good because we need to formalize the world economy without presupposing that anyone in that economy shares any principles. Otherwise, we would be presupposing that capitalism requires homogeneity. No, it can really keep these, let's say, systems apart in some sense and still unify them in one way. So what we call fetishism of the commodity for guys like Kojin Karatani, Slavoj Žižek, and others is a very objective principle that you cannot see the unity of world economy from the standpoint of people. If you adopt the idea that people are the synthetic point of view of economic life, you only see strange phenomena that don't really add up. if you think that things are the synthetic point of view, what Karatani says that, well, basically money is a social contract between things. Things abdicate from the right of expressing value, and they all give that right to one commodity, which is money. And only money expresses the value of other commodities. Just like the sovereign is the only one that expresses the will of individuals in the sovereign pact in Hobbes. So if you accept the standpoint of things, suddenly you see the connection between, you see the logic that is ruling over this world economy. If you take the standpoint of people, you cannot see it. So that's a way in which it's an objective phenomenology. Like you need to adopt the perspective, the hypothesis that the synthetic point of view is not cognition. Cognition needs to be, let's say, mediated by money in order to have access to the logic of that world. If you were to directly try to grasp it, you would be missing the point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a way of understanding what you're saying that I think clarifies the concept, because we can say, look, from the standpoint of people, we have normative systems of use, or however we want to call this, not in the economic sense, but in the sense of how they are inscribed in a certain horizon of meaning and so and sense. Things have uses for in these normative systems, but that's from the standpoint of the people who are actors in this system. And there is no world economy from that perspective. There is no logic of a world there, one world. If you adopt the standpoint of things, and therefore what we could call a cognitive point of view, the synthesis of this comes from things, and especially from money, then you can see what it is that is unified about this world, right? My impression is that this is the underlying thing that you're working on, and it seems to me that the lack of care with, for now at least, with the distinctions makes it seem like difference between markets where we're talking about proprietors of goods exchanging things. In other words, from the standpoint of the actors and people, there are multiple markets. But from the standpoint of value, these are regions of one world, right? And then you have that's why you have a nice, interesting, specific economic problem in your hand, which is, well, I need to model this. I need both some philosophical presuppositions concerning the possibility of thinking a world without somebody to perceive that world, a subject of that world, because we just defined kind of disjunction between subjects who are trapped into sub-regions and the general logic, right? So I need something that doesn't presuppose this transcendental subject, but at the same time is capable of organizing the logic of how these things appear for some other synthetic point of view.
Yes.
That would be what Badiou might offer, right? A theory of worlds where you can, a definition of appearance that doesn't presuppose that they appear to anyone in particular, uses a more powerful tool, supposedly, than what Marxists do with dialectics, because it's capable of formalizing things in a slightly different way, which is category theory. So my impression is that if you too quickly equate market and world, you have two consequences that you don't want. First is that you make this idea of a world economy disappear under the existence of multiple markets, and that's already adopting microeconomical presuppositions rather than Marxist ones. And second, you need to assume that money is transworldly, in the sense that Badiou suggests that only truths are capable. For Badiou, truths are that thing that survive many worlds, or at least can stitch themselves through many worlds. So they appear in one way for, like, tragedy. Theater appears in a way in the world of Greek ancient tragedy, but something of ancient Greek tragedy can be taken up again in contemporary tragedy, depending on how you continue to stitch certain investigations together, right? It it seems like it's politically useful to distinguish this sort of generic process that is somehow indifferent to the limits of a world from the sort of kind of expanding sense that world economy is able to, let's say, eat other worlds, right?
Yeah.
It's more like a strategy of what Badiou calls an envelope, the sort of expansion of the limits of a world, than, let's say, the true movement between worlds that really don't have anything in common. Because otherwise you will lead to a third problem, which is the idea that these clashes between, let's say, normative systems are even in some sense. Let's say, when you mention war and sovereign fights towards national independence, it's not simply the this is what Marx already saw, and many political economists of leftist orientation agree, that most wars for national independence in the beginning of the 20th century, even though they seemed like they were fighting against oppressors, they were also fighting for the right to be included in the international market. So it wasn't like, say, an external conflict between two forces, two systems, so much as at the same time another game was being played. While it seemed like we're fighting against our lords and fighting for independence, the same independence and sovereignty also came, let's say, with the collateral effect of further including us into the international market. So because, let's say, in the case of Brazil, it's not good for an international market. It's not the best way to exploit value to simply extract things from the colony. It's much better if the colony wants to sell you things, because they also buy labor power, they have an internal market, they also are consuming commodities and so on. So if you simply present this as the case of markets clashing, right, when it's in fact two normative systems clashing, but the consolidation of a market in the case of, let's say, of Native Americans, actually the effect of the expansion of the world economy that will happen through this fight between normative systems. So I think that the precision there between markets and normative systems on the one hand, then what do you mean by world and markets? How are the two things related? Do markets need to be considered worlds in this sort of transcendentals? They're separate regions with kind of closure or not? I think all of that will be very important. Otherwise, we'll get into this sort of head,
Well, okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, isn't it possible that markets can be considered worlds without saying that all worlds are markets?
No, I didn't say that. But okay, but
I would say just a market is just one type of world. It's like it's not all worlds should be considered markets. So I mean, doesn't that kind of bypass this problem of?
No, I'm not saying that all worlds are marked or anything. I'm just saying that from the standpoint of what I think are the properties of what I think the reason why we need some crazy ass objective phenomenology with a lot of mathematical formalism is because we want to formalize a particular sort of world which doesn't have as its synthetic point of view people, but things.
Yes.
Price remains, Hayek says this with all letters. Price is an information index for people, for the man on the go, as he calls it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Value is not. That's my point. Like, that's why you are talking about value and price. Price is commodity for people, right? Price is things appearing to people. Value is things appearing for things. So, sure, markets can be seen as worlds. Anything can in that, but it's not that rich of an idea in the sense that it doesn't require an objective phenomenology. Price, the idea of price and markets as a sort of closure where prices work, that idea is formalizable with what economic models use, and they are very happy with all the presuppositions about the subject of rational economic decision as the sort of basic phenomenology of economics. Prices appear for people. That's the best way of commodities appearing for people is through prices. Otherwise, we cannot coordinate activity, economic activity. So there you go. What I think that you're introducing that is new is that you're taking Marx's idea of value, which is an idea, I totally agree, of something that doesn't appear to people. Right? When Marx has its relations, fetishism of the commodities, relations between people appearing as relations between things, you're taking this very seriously and saying, yes, it is appearing to things as well.
Yes.
Not relations between things appearing to people. Right? That's what price is. You get the value of things, and then you have buyers and sellers, and they negotiate arbitrarily based on a lot of ridiculous assumptions that each has and appetites and whatnot. A lot of arbitrary and contingent extra determinations are put into the scene to determine the price. But you can still tell that prices are different from value. Value is a sort of a tractor below the price fluctuation.
Yeah.
So it's because prices are being determined by, and they're connecting to something which is not to us. So it's when you want to approach that crazy idea, right? Then an economist will tell you, but how can you even start talking about appearing? In a Marxist will agree with the neoliberal economist to say, how can you even talk about appearances appearing to something other than us? You know, most Marxists interpret fetishism of the commodity in terms of things appearing to us as a mystification. It's an illusion. So you're showing that it is thinkable that we can model Marxist economic theory without that assumption that it's a mystification. This is actually the objective case. If I remove the subject, I can still model all of this without this for us approach, without having to presuppose we are the synthetic point of view of this.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's exactly the direction I should go. I mean, yeah, I agree with your criticism there that the logics of worlds is a much richer theory than we run the risk of reducing Badiou's system a bit if we just start from the assumption that we can just apply the idea of a world to a market.
I mean, I think we can apply. I mean, I'm not saying that we can't. I'm just saying that I think that you're pointing to something that is the nice thing is not so much showing that it can also be thought in this way, but showing the things that can only be thought in this way, right?
Yeah.
So, and I have the impression that that's where the what you call a cognitive is very nice, because this is implied in most theories concerning world economy. What it implies when it says capitalism doesn't really require us to share like normative evaluating systems. Like people can really want things for totally absolutely different reasons. No relation established between people here. But to actually go as far as this thesis implies requires a very weird formal machinery.
Yeah, I think a good thing that you pointed out is simply that the standpoint is not the individual, right? The standpoint is this other thing, which could say it's like commodity, standpoint of the commodity, or the standpoint of exchange, which from that perspective, it's something. The question of like a unified global market doesn't necessarily mean that all differences have been erased, right? Like you said, capitalism thrives on the gap between different normative systems. You need that gap. So I guess when I talk about markets kind of encompassing other markets, I don't necessarily mean that you're homogenizing anything, right? But yeah, maybe if we go on further in the slides, we can kind of get closer to what you were talking about, because I did want to talk about this acognitive thing, which I think is like a missing piece of this discussion.
Okay.
Okay, so let me refresh this because I think it's the update. Okay. So yeah, again, these 3 points on the same subject, right? This idea of phenomenology. Okay, point 2 is, we already covered point 1. It's basically this gap between use and exchange value. And then second, we have this idea that there's some formal structure to exchange. When you exchange things with someone else, it seems like a very simple thing, but it has a formal structure, something about equivalence, equivalence relation even, that is fundamentally mathematical, but it doesn't arise from our thinking, right? It's not a formal system that, and really, to be honest, like most mathematics does not arise from, like it's not, doesn't have an idealist origin, right? Most mathematics arises from some kind of social practice. So in this sense, money is a particular, is one of many particular abstractions that has an abstract side and a concrete practical or social side to it. And so we have to negotiate those 2 sides as well. And then point 3, another feature of this formula, value as appearance, is that there are different types of subjectivity. And when we introduce the idea of money, one type of subjectivity seems to kind of disappear, right? This would be the kind of this traditional subjectivity that we, kind of recognize as being, the free subject or the subject of desires in psychoanalytic terms, right? It's that subjectivity kind of takes a back seat to this other, you would say like a game theory subject, or a subject that has to do with competition and maximizing utility, right? So there's these 2 different types of subjectivity, and one kind of takes the place of the other when you introduce the idea of money. So I wanted, whatever theory we have or whatever interpretation we have of the formula of value as appearance, that interpretation has to respect these 3 aspects, right? So I think, yeah, any conversation we talk about Badiou's notion of the subject is important here. Obviously, Marx's notion of surplus value and the idea that subjectivity, regarding point 3, subjectivity has to do with anticipating the future. These things have to be considered when we talk about value as appearance. So yeah, I guess to address some of the points that you brought up, Gabriel, it's this: can we think value from this objective standpoint? It does require a different machinery, right? And I'm proposing that here we use the peculiar properties of money and the kind of taking the ideology of the market as at face value. I think that's a good method. I think there is something, exactly the thing you said about fetishism being not simply a cynical thing, right? Fetishism, normally we read fetishism as like, okay, look, we're all deluded by money. Money is presenting this illusion, this kind of shroud over things, and we are falling to this trap, right? We're falling into a trap when we believe in money. But another way to read that is to say that, okay, no, actually, money is actually revealing a different type of world. It's not the character of all worlds, although that would be the ideological essence of it, is that money proposes the idea that all worlds can be captured in a market. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't reveal something at the same time, right? The idea of fetishism the way Marx illustrates it, it does make a certain type of thinking possible. And so taking that type of thinking at face value, I think is interesting. You know, it's tricky because we have to kind of flirt with the neoliberal, the way that capitalism kind of views itself in a way, right? Which is the neoliberal perspective. But flirting with that and bringing all this mathematical machinery in, I think it might produce some kind of interesting interpretation of this formula. Okay. So yeah, regarding the question of cognitive versus acognitive mappings, I'm proceeding from this Hayekian idea that prices capture information about the world, and this process is more accurate than our minds, right? So a cognitive map is how we perceive the world, right? It's how we orient ourselves in the world. But the problem is that the complexity of the market is so great that no one person can capture that effectively in their minds. And this is Hayek's critique of central planning. His idea is that the market is so complicated, the allocation of goods and services is such a complicated task that if we give that to an individual or any group of individuals, it will ultimately fail. Instead, the way the market solves this problem, which is he calls the use of knowledge, right, in society, is by capturing this knowledge in price. Right? Price is the mechanism that kind of coagulates or absorbs knowledge, but it's a specific type of knowledge. As Gabriel was saying, it's the man on the go, right? The man in the spot. The knowledge of that man is not a formalizable type of knowledge. It's not axiomatic, or it's not formal in the sense of mathematics or science. Instead, it's kind of come say like it's knowledge of the best place to go to do this, right? It's practical knowledge, right? I know someone who sells this thing cheaper than elsewhere, or I know this person who makes the best kind of I don't know, food. He's a good chef. I know this thing, but it doesn't necessarily it's not something that can simply be generalized, right? It's not general knowledge. It's very localized knowledge. And this type of knowledge cannot be compiled into one something that an individual mind can comprehend, right? That's Hayek's whole point, that there's a certain kind of knowledge that you need prices to capture. Any other way of doing it is going to miss the nature of this knowledge. So my critique of Hayek here is simply that we still metaphorize this process as a mind, right? When we talk about markets, we talk about the invisible hand. We talk about like a hive mind. We still use these terms to describe the process of prices converging. And so I think that if we want to take Hayek seriously, we have to go kind of beyond his own conception, because even he kind of uses this metaphor, right, of the market as a mind. So I think we don't have the language yet to describe that. And that's what I'm trying to build is a way of describing the process of collecting these price signals together in such a way that we can't confuse it with simply a mind. And I think a topology is a good starting point, right? I think topology is different enough from the idea of a mind that we can yield some interesting insights from that, and also avoid the ideological traps of considering this. And this is why the whole acognitive mappings is important, right? And acognitive mapping is something that's not mental in any way, right? But it's a mapping, right? It's a mapping is more general than cognition. It's category theory is the study of mappings. So I think that's where that enters into the picture. Is like we want to study mappings in general, not simply those that can be comprehended in this in terms of thought. Okay, but yeah, it's confusing too because then again, if we can understand acognitive mappings, then aren't we creating a new cognitive mapping that includes an acognitive mapping? And I think that's kind of where this argument is a bit shaky, right? Like, ultimately, we want to be able to understand markets. So maybe it's the question of where should we start instead of starting from how individuals see the world around them, how they make sense of markets. We start from the prices themselves, the price mechanism itself.
But I think that a good way of making that distinction, and I saw that Caron also wanted to ask about this, is, for example, mathematics. I think it's a great example of this because I would say that let's say that you don't have. I tried to work through this in that text I wrote on cognitive mapping as well and so on. That I said, well, we need to actually have 3 terms rather than 2. So let's say you have world, and you have, let's say, individuals or our minds, right? They're not really those 2 terms, like how worlds are mapped onto minds, but you should add a 3rd term in between the 2 that we call the mapping, this sort of artificial mediation. Hayek was stepping forward after Marx in saying that there is a mediation that is not money is not just mystifying about the world. Money is a mediator to the world. It's an alternative mediator to people.
Yeah.
Prices, they are giving us information about the world that we could not have otherwise. But there are then 2 functions there. The function that maps individuals and mediators and worlds. Right? And my point is that I think we should distinguish between 2 ways in which individuals and mediators can relate. Because you can put the mediator under the synthetic force of individuals, and let's say measure the validity of these mediators by their capacity to be included into our minds or be pictured by us, right? Or you can do the other way around. You can have individuals, let's say, giving ground to these mediators, and giving ground to their capacity to be the synthetic point of view. Mathematics is an exercise in giving ground on your synthetic point of view. Right? I mean, the formal practices, they are very much based on selecting a rule that is not in your own measure, and that you evaluate your own practice by that external rule. I don't think that that's what Hayek meant by price. For him, prices are the best because they, let's say, reduce the market to the size of the individual. But doing that, compression loses a lot of information and makes it so that you can only have that sort of approach. But let's say mathematics is an inverse process, right? It's all about the enriching of our knowledge of structures based on these models, precisely because we give a lot of ground on the sort of, let's say, subjective richness of the experience with these formalisms, like a very arid subjective experience, because you're giving precedence to the formal writing over your understanding of it, right? A statement like Cantor's, like, I see it, but I don't believe it. Like, I just proved transfinite numbers, There are many infinites. I'm seeing that this is true, but I don't believe it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this raises another question for me. I think if you're taking money to be somewhat like a purveyor of information that is not and it's not from the start um, compossible with the subject's grasp. What in practice? I mean, what does it mean to see it either compressed as something that gives information about the actions of the individuals that are engaged in the commercial trading, or what does it mean in practice to see it as conveying information above and beyond such individuals? I mean, in practice, what kind of information does enter the picture if you see it one way or another way? I mean, if you see it like Hayek sees it, or if you give precedence over to the formalism itself, to the information that is conveyed through value itself, not necessarily to personal individual cognition. And why? Okay.
Sure.
Should I repeat? Should I repeat everything?
No, I think I understood your question. I have
Yeah.
a proposed example. What does it mean in practice to make that distinction between these two functions, where
Yeah, but
indicators are related under precedence of individuals?
yes,
The
that's it.
mediators are related under precedence of the mediation.
Yes, that's it.
Is that the distinction between going to the market and looking at prices and working in a company? When you work in a company, you're also involved in pricings and things like this, but the internal structure of the company requires you to work in a certain way, to behave in a certain way,
Okay.
due to more information than mere prices of things.
Yes.
You're now engaged in changing prices, you're engaged in a lot of other aspects of market behavior than not simply what is the best thing I can buy with the money I have in the certain conditions. Let's say you can go into. That's why I think that there's a big discussion about how firms have an intelligence that is not reducible to the intelligence of workers in the firm. It's a researcher that Ashby guy. I forgot his first name. Ron.
I don't know him. No, I don't know. So,
You know that cybernetics guy,
oh yeah, what's the last name?
Ashby.
Ashby, yeah.
Ashby.
Who gives a fuck what his name
Yeah,
was?
yeah, whatever.
He, as everyone in cybernetics, made money with economic stuff in financial markets and stuff, and he was working on a theory of embedded intelligence in firms based on how firms are designed. So saying, look, the way that firms are designed, if you look at the internal way that they are structured, the production process, the communication process, hierarchies, organograms, and all this stuff, you're seeing things about the markets that they kind of congeal, they consolidate in that format, but nobody really thought about it. It's the best way to answer to the market, but it says more about the market than just price, because it talks also about labor conditions, motivation, availability of time, brands, and a lot of other information that the price itself sometimes doesn't capture. So that would be perhaps a way of thinking about practical difference between, at least, perhaps not an inversion of the function between individual and this mediation, but at least that there is some richness to this discussion that is not reducible to simply how things appear for us. Because at firms, you're not really counting there as a buyer, nor as a seller, right? You're counting as a component of something that is bought or sold.
Yeah.
A bit like in mathematics, I would say you're not really counting as the deducer or the prover of something, right? You're composing a proof. Like the proof is a thing that proves.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, this would be my next question. How does this relate to the idea that price is still in the picture? Nevertheless, it's not the last instance you go to get information about it, about what you're looking. I mean, there's still some ambiguity for me whether these answers are not the question. But okay, I think that's good enough for now. I think.
Yeah, but that's the sort of thing that I'm also interested. I have no idea how to answer that. It's just a hypothesis on how we could kind of
because my criticism of this answer would be, okay, you are considering a lot of more information. It's not just a question of seeing price in the last instance as conveying information about buyers and sellers, or the other hypothesis of price as conveying information about the system itself. It seems, I mean, it's kind of tricky because at first, in the first grasp, I mean, up front, we would think that the second hypothesis has less information than the first, because the first is including the action of empirical subjects, and whereas the second, you get locked in a abstract structure. But I think I see what you're saying, in the sense that this abstract structure, if you see it as it is for itself, it actually envelops more information than just the empirical behaviors of buyers and sellers.
Yeah, I think that if I'm not mistaken, Dennis will end up going into this, but this idea that, and even, I mean, this actually goes into a very interesting point, because this idea that value is like things appearing for themselves in economics, where price is them appearing for us. Marx has this very clear kind of underlying motto in all of Capital, that capitalist categories, the way that value form is developed into money form, credit, financial capital, it kind of always tries to mimic in its concrete practical existence its very general abstract structure. So money becoming credit, it's both concrete historical development and it coming closer to something that it always already was, less of a matter of a particular object and more just of a numerical proportion with less substance, right? But derivatives and the sort of rapid financial exploitation of prices that you get with algorithmic exchange today, that's pretty much price trying to mimic value, because it's prices talking to prices, right?
Yes, I understand. Yes, absolutely.
So there's a nice development there, but yeah, I mean, all of this is very tentative for me. I'm still having a hard time.
It's definitely very helpful for me to clarify my own ideas. Yeah, exactly what you guys are saying is as you're saying, the idea of the future, I think, is one of the key dimensions. That's why this presentation includes time, right? That's where I'm trying to go with this, because Hayek's description of price is still a bit it's a bit naive, because it still considers, like, it doesn't consider what happens when you have a market where I can now guess the price of what other people think is the price of something, right? That's a new type of information. One thing is saying that you have some information that a local individual possesses, and that information adds to the price of something. So that you know that in the future there will be a shortage. Maybe you're a farmer and you see, based on the weather, that there will be a shortage of apples next year, because you see that because you're on the ground harvesting the apples yourself. So you know about it first, and that information becomes captured in price. But another thing is saying like you are a stock trader and you make a wager that the future price of apples will go one way or the other. They're two different types of information that you're going on. Of course, if you knew a farmer, if you're a stock trader and you know a farmer that could give you that information, it would help you. But I think that fundamentally, it's like you're saying that we have a self-reflexive moment that Hayek is not really like Hayek just kind of passes by really quickly um, because yeah, with the advent of derivatives and credit, you have not only the price of services, but you also have the price of the price as a way of measuring the fluctuation of price. Let's say, like I can actually make a bet on whether there will be a fluctuation in prices, and I think this is something that yeah we have to consider.
Yeah, I think that a way of making that argument now that you just made and putting it succinctly is to say Hayek's thesis is prices are the best mediators for our access to the world, and this has the underlying supposition that he doesn't discuss, that prices, that these mediators must appear for us. Let's say it's to be a mediator is to appear for us. But then you're saying, and the thing is that, well, but the development of the price system led to derivatives, which prove that prices can appear for prices. I mean, they can debate, they can prices of prices and things like this, meaning that there is still, let's say, an added variable of what it appear, where it counts to, let's say, that it's not included in Hayek's schema. Therefore, we still need to ask the question, okay, is this mediation functioning insofar as it brings information to the actor, the man on the go, down buying and selling things, or can it also function in a sort of more objectively, let's say, setup sense? Actually, now that I say this out loud, it already seems like it's a flawed argument. But
I think what's at stake as well is how much transparent is through price the situation. How much how more transparent can price turn the situation, make the situation? How more transparent? Because once you get to derivatives, you have like second order, third order price, fourth order price, and you have it, you name it. So now it gets to a point that it's not only an epistemological question or what I would say a principled question whether to see price as the result of the exchange between empirical individuals or as a what we were saying like an abstract structure. I mean, a purveyor of information inside an abstract structure. But it seems there's also a pragmatic sense in which the second hypothesis is now better because you don't have you can't know beforehand why there is such and such fluctuation in the market once you get to second order, third order, fourth order price. So it's difficult to trace back price to the movements of buyers and sellers now. So the transparency is not given anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it's exactly a sign that Hayek's analysis is missing something, right?
But I would just clarify there. I think that, I mean, Hayek is partially going in the direction that Caron said, because he actually is saying it's price versus transparency. There is no transparency, therefore we need price, right? Nobody can.
You're right. You're right.
Okay. But at the same time, I think that the precision that needs to be made is, okay, there can be no transparency, but this lack of transparency is still, let's say, you can get around it with price, right? You can get enough with price. What you're talking about is precisely that this is actually a gradative, more local principle than such a general principle as Hayek says.
Could we say that for Hayek, even though okay, price is the tool to be used exactly because the movements of the market are not transparent. Okay, I agree. That's right. But could we say that perhaps um, price is what do we say? Price is transparent to price itself for Hayek, and then
Yeah,
with
that's what I
derivative market with the derivative markets, prices are not transparent to prices anymore. Something like that.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Like derivatives seem to show that these guys didn't account for the fact that the interaction between prices and the pricing of prices leads to a sort of crazy loop that, let's say, doesn't guarantee the consistency of the relation between prices. Create crash.
Okay. Yeah.
Kind of how they call those kind of second, crashes. I forgot the name of those, like happening on flash crashes and things like this. So I mean, I think the formal way of stating this is that Hayek, and I mean this is the classical criticism. Hayek assumed that prices are on the side of economical equilibrium. So they're information and equilibrium, and not. So you exchange transparency for prices, but the equilibrium you wanted with transparency you get with prices. Whereas you can see prices can go into loopholes that create crazy crises, which are singular points of stability, but critical points, not really beneficial ones, right?
Yeah. I see. Yeah, it's getting clearer now.
Yeah, actually, guys, so I need to go in like 15 minutes, and I still have half of the slides to go. So maybe we can, maybe I'll skip a few things and then we can go to some more important.
Is it? I mean, etched in stone that we have to keep going in the same loop? I think maybe can't you have like maybe two meetings because you weren't able to finish today? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I'm fine with that too.
Yeah, I could meet tomorrow as well. Same time.
Hard for tomorrow. Me. Yeah, it's hard for me as well.
No, but even like keeping it like for the next scheduled date, like in
2 weeks, yes.
2 weeks, but you continue, you know?
Yeah, something like that. Because you weren't able to finish today, so that's. I mean, this is okay for me.
Yeah. Also, it works for me because a lot of what you're working on kind of overlaps with things I wanted to discuss, so it would work.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, we can do that. Yeah. So I'll just go as far as we can.
Okay.
Sure. So yeah, I just wanted to point out, the question of credit, the question of credit, and the question of derivatives and these higher order financial instruments is really important to, if we want to broaden the analysis to, we've already established this idea. Okay, value is somehow objective. It's an objective appearance, and money is like a way of seeing this objectivity, right? It's not, of course, it's not completely transparent, which is the point, right? That it's not like simply looking at prices you can see a clear picture of the world, but nevertheless, there is a sort of thinking or sort of logical process that's happening. So this is exactly why mathematics is such a important tool, because mathematics allows us to formalize things that we cannot see, but nevertheless have some kind of logical consistency. The slide here that I wanted to just point out is that in addition to the traditional banks, the banking sector that we have that provides the credit for most people, we also have this new thing called shadow banking, which is like basically whenever you lend money to someone off the books, right? You're in essence part of the shadow bank sector. So actually, recently we've seen that the shadow bank has surpassed traditional banks. You have this entire kind of unknown sector um, of liability these days. It's not simply like, okay, so we see only basically a drop in the bucket in terms of the amount of money that's being exchanged. And that's something we also need to consider. So yeah, so how, given that, how does the market see itself in terms of establishing the price? So I was looking at the way that markets function on the stock market, or when you are trading derivatives. What is the function? How is it establishing prices? And I came upon this idea of the limit book, right, or the order book in the market, and I thought it was very interesting because it has a very clear mathematical uh, origin, right? The idea of convergence of functions, um, right? To sum it up, right? Every function can kind of be considered as there are functions which converge and there are functions which diverge, right? And functions which converge can basically be formalized as an infinite series of numbers added together, right? Or an infinite series that within a certain radius will sum up um, to a finite number. So this very pure mathematical idea used in calculus, we can find it today in the idea of the order book, which it functions by separating transactions into two groups, right? You have the ask or offers to sell and offers to buy, right? And the lowest offer to sell is called the ask, and the highest offer to buy is called the bid, and the gap between them is called the bid ask spread. Um, so obviously, if I bid something high enough such that it's within the set of ask prices, that would become an instant transaction, right? So let's say the ask is $10, and I bid 11, meaning I'm offering to buy at 11. Someone's off. The lowest is offer to sell is 10. So obviously, I'll find someone to buy, right? So this is not a problem. The problem comes when something arrives in between the spread, right? So if I make a bid that is not high enough to meet the ask price, at this point we have the function of something called a market maker. And this market maker is a entity that their job is solely to facilitate transactions. They are rewarded for every time a transaction occurs. So what they do is they kind of they buy at the bid price and sell at the ask price, right? So let's say I'm in the market and I'm trying to sell something for $10, and someone wants to buy that thing for $8, right? But I'm not willing to part with my good at 8. I want to sell it at 10. Well, the market maker is someone who will buy that thing from me and then sell it to the person at 8, taking a small loss. But then they will be compensated for they'll be compensated for that because their job is to facilitate these transactions.
But who pays this guy?
So they're paid by institutions that make money from facilitating the transaction. So when you enter into the market, you pay a fee. These markets charge a fee to you for facilitating the transaction.
I see.
Yeah, and then they get a cut of that fee. So from this perspective, the liquidity, basically the function of this market maker is to create liquidity, right? Liquidity in the sense of the time it takes for me to convert my commodity into money, right? I want to lower that time, right? I don't want to wait. If someone is not willing to meet my price, if I'm trying to sell something, um, the market maker speeds up that process so that I can always find a seller that's willing to purchase some good from me. And I thought this is an interesting mechanism because what is this? Uh, where does the need to create liquidity come from, right? Why is it that we need this market maker to? Because another option is just to simply wait, right? We could wait until conditions change, and then whatever I'm willing to sell it for becomes the new price, right? Um, but the market maker is one that ensures the continuity or the minimal gap between these two prices.
Yeah, I can't. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like your interest in this is that the purple thing, the ask function, say, is organized around a certain normative principle because it's not worth selling it lower than $10.
Mm.
But the consumer market, the guy who's bidding to buy it, is actually organized around another set of principles where it's not really worth buying if it's above a certain price.
Yeah.
So it goes back to that idea that somehow you're studying something that stitches together these differently organized normative things, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this function of stitching together these two systems or these two values, the two, maybe you can say two markets, I don't know, is yeah, is why I wanted to talk about this.
One thing I know, a distinction that might be helpful here is the distinction between how much things are worth and how much they're value.
Mhm.
Because worth is economically more connected with wealth, which is rich. It's a sort of idea of richness, which is not really the same as value, right? For example, things can have a lot of value and be worth in terms of how much wealth you have. That's very difficult to consume it or to have any liquidity with it. You can have a lot of capital, but you cannot do anything with it, and you can starve.
Mhm.
Right? Wealth is more connected to property, goods, and some determinations of what you're talking about, where value is not really connected to that. Value is more connected to capacity of thing to produce more money, right?
Yeah, good point.
Worth is a good term to worth and wealth are good terms to talk about when we're talking about property owners. And value perhaps is better when you're talking about the specific Marxist thing,
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so I think here we would be talking about worth. Although then again, there's the extraction of value from buying low and selling high, right? I mean, this process is applies to both the just single transactions, but also you can make money simply by anticipating where these purple and blue dots will be in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So this idea of gluing these two things together, I thought was a good. It was a good starting point to connect with the early ideas of sheaves and bundles, these mathematical ideas, which are also about maintaining a certain continuity, a certain kind of like it's satisfying a certain mathematical principle. Um, Obviously, it's done here for expediency, right? If something happens and you suddenly need to sell your possessions so you can have food to eat, the market maker provides a useful function because you don't have to wait to sell your item, right? The person will the entity that is performing that function will guarantee you that you can sell your item so that you could supposedly buy some food. so that this function is useful on a practical level. But on a formal level, this function it's more mysterious, right? I think we can look at it more critically, right? It's not simply a matter of practicality, because a lot of the commodities that are being bought and sold are not. It's not usually because people need to eat that they're selling those things. It's because people want to make more money from the transaction itself. Okay, so that's just a aside. Um, and also this is what an actual limit book kind of looks like. It's more chaotic than. So if you look at the y-axis of this graph, I don't know how clear it is, you guys, but the y-axis is the price, and then the blue, you have the blue dots, which are the bids, and the asks are the red, I believe. So you see they're kind of creating this curve, right? The point that they meet is what we call the price. So actually, price is just a generalization or an abstraction from this more basic process of matching buyers and sellers. And the market maker is kind of the one that glues the top and the bottom halves so that you can have a price. Okay, so the question I want to raise is, can we construct a different map of this data? And earlier, I actually, to go back a bit, I showed this slide of the planet, right? You have countries, and you have the amount of economic activity happening in these countries. So you have this kind of easily digestible cognitive mapping, right? Literal map of the world. And overlaid on this map is let's say, the intensity of capitalism occurring. But when we talk about markets and all the complexity that we have just gone through, what if we could map this process onto a different sort of space other than the planet, right? Yeah, what if the nation state, for example, is not the proper it's not the proper subset of this space, right? In the case of this map, right, you have a space, and then you partition the space into geographical borders. But obviously, we know that the way that the markets actually operate it's really indifferent to these borders. And this is one very immediate consequence of this is, the crises that have to do with relocation, right? Like migrant crises, or refugee crises, right? It's the fact that people need to move around it's because these markets are collapsing in some areas and flourishing in other areas. But it doesn't have anything to do with the geographical lines themselves, right? There's some other more imminent logic there happening. And so when we map them onto this nation state space, we lose information, right? So I'm proposing that we come up with a different way of mapping this, right? And then this image here is actually kind of unrelated. It's it has nothing to do with money, but it has to do with creating tangent spaces from some other space. But you see, there's like a kind of a flat plane that's changing as you move it across a sphere, right? Something like that is what I'm suggesting. That we can map the interaction of one space to another space and get some important modeling properties. Let's say we can model something with that. Okay, so yeah, I don't think we'll have time to go into the rules of topology, but that is important to how does mathematics think of spaces in general. My idea is that, yeah, this is where we would get into the hardcore math part, because we could find out the rules of spaces in general and then figure out how, what does it mean to change map, right? From the picture here, the picture of the market here, changing that map to something more general, or something that respects the properties of the market. But yeah, I think yeah, the key word here is we can use this idea of partially ordered sets, or the partial order relation, as a way of grasping topology. Really, what I'm interested in is the idea of bundles and sheaves, which I definitely will talk more about this next time. But the idea of a bundle is that we can take one space and map it onto another space, such that the second space, the space you're mapping to, can be considered as having greater degrees of freedom. So, for example, this picture here from the book by Penrose, it depicts the geodesics in relativity theory. This idea that what we consider to be a straight line is what we consider to be a straight line can be actually moved around. Let's say what is straight in a local sense can be curved globally. And the reason we can do that is by slicing up space-time into discrete moments. And at any given moment, the definition of straight line will change. But viewed locally, this definition remains the same. So if you are, in any point in space-time, in relativity, for example, your perspective of what a straight line is the same. It's the normal idea, but mathematically, we can show that this straight line becomes curved over a long distance, right? For example, under the effects of gravity, gravity curves space and time, but that is not visible within a single slice. It is only visible once we've kind of glued a lot of these frames together, right? Or these slices of space-time. So I wanted to take this idea in terms of prices, apply it to prices, because at any given moment, the price of something seems fixed, right? But we know, there, because of inflation, because of supply and demand, the price of something will change over time. But this distinction between the local environment in which a price is stable and the global environment in which prices can fluctuate, I think that is the analogy I'm trying to draw here. That hopefully can become more than an analogy if we understand the math better.
Yeah, man, I must say, I'm like, it's almost midnight here. I'm very near my point of saturation, like where I can't really digest much more.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think I agree with Caron's idea. I think it would be great if you could continue from that point next time. We can pick it up when my turn would be. I have the impression that it will kind of coincide with, let's say, kind of end of the year holiday. So it might be hard for us to meet in 15 days after next meeting.
Yeah.
So we could use the 2 meetings to kind of conclude, and then pick it up again after the new year. I don't know how exactly the dates will go, but
Yeah, that sounds good.
yeah, this way you can actually, finish it without rush.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely need to elaborate some of these ideas. Because I wanted to take a very intuitive approach, but maybe it works better if next time we can go more into detail.
Yeah, my impression is that from the text that you wrote that I've read, I have the impression that once you establish the premises of what you want to do, you actually already have developed some stuff. Whereas the best presentation of those premises concerning mathematical models of economics, this philosophical approach to Marxism, where value can be taken as a sort of objective phenomenology. These things that are the ones that, of course, this will influence perhaps how you read all this work into the math of it and so on. But I would almost divide the project into 2, one that concerns prices and category theory, and another one that concerns, let's say, the underlying philosophical approach you're taking to this. Both, I think, merit some extra discussion. But of course, next time you're focusing on the mathematics of it a bit more. But I think considering the 2 as parallel might be better than having one and then you're going to the next once the first is settled. Because it seems to me that there are a bunch of things to be discussed there, like even your statement concerning prices, bundles of prices, the shiftification, and then value. Kind of this goes all the way inverses the whole Marxist approach, where we have an abstract logic we call value, functions like an attractor, and then we bring into the picture a bunch of other variables that will determine fluctuations of prices in local situations. Like you're actually trying to arrive at value through pricing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like you're trying to talk about prices, you accept a bunch of premises of microeconomics, talk about demand and supply, markets. That's the economic theory that you're in dialogue with at first. You almost want to arrive at some Marxist thesis concerning value out of the theory of prices, rather than find a place for prices within the theory of value, which is called the transformation problem in Marxism, right?
Yeah.
I find that very interesting because it means that you also are willing to, let's say, force into Marxism a bunch of aspects of liberal economy that doesn't really have a place in it. Take some stakes on complexity, some stakes on let's say the cognitive or whatever the mapping dimension of prices. I agree that this is not accounted for by Marx. Like if you go into chapter 4 on money in Capital, where he talks about the functions of money, a means of payment, measure of value, hoarding, and world money. Cognitive mapping is neither of those. It's a 5th function. And Hayek knew this, and Marx didn't. So what does it mean to include this, right? Marx wouldn't have written about fetishism of commodity in the way he did with all those kind of ambivalences, were he to have a clear take on, let's say, the necessary role of mediators in the social world due to complexity elements. So it does seem like you're adding to Marxism rather than simply criticizing marginal utility theory. So there's a lot of interesting debates to be had on the philosophical, political side that I don't think should be solved or cleared before you do the other stuff. So it's a nice way to, probably a nice thing to think about this as parallel research, because one might influence the other as you're going, rather than take this discussion on markets, world economy as sort of initial thing, introductory discussion, more informal, and then you get into the hard stuff. it seems like you're gonna have to work on both, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, well, thanks so much, guys, for giving me some feedback. I think I definitely know what I'm going to work on now.
No problem, and I'm a bit. I wish you didn't show me that crazy picture with the sphere and the plane. Mentions to Penrose, so I wouldn't be so scared. But
yeah, what a convenient time to end right before.
Yeah, exactly on that picture.
Yeah.
Okay, guys. So yeah, we'll meet again in a couple weeks.
A couple of weeks, yes. Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Very enlightening for me.
I need to go. I'm barely managing to speak, so I'll just.
Okay. Good night for everybody.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. See ya.